Have you ever been the forgotten one? The one everyone assumes will just handle everything while others get all the praise? That's been my life for as long as I can remember. But the day my parents stole something precious from me to give to my sister, I decided I'd had enough. Little did I know walking away would only be the beginning of a family drama I never asked for, but it might just be the best decision I ever made. Growing up, it was clear that Jessica was the center of my parents' universe. She was 2 years older than me, stunningly beautiful, and had this magnetic personality that made everyone gravitate toward her. She was the type who could bat her eyelashes and get out of trouble, charm her way into anything, and somehow always end up on top. I, on the other hand, was quieter and more reserved. I liked reading, excelled in school, and poured myself into extracurriculars. But no matter how hard I tried, I was always Jessica's little sister, and that's how my parents treated me. Jessica's victories were larger-than-life events. When she won a local beauty pageant, my parents threw her a party with a DJ, catering, and a professionally made banner that read, "Congratulations, our beautiful star." Meanwhile, when I placed first in a statewide debate competition, they barely acknowledged it. My mom said, "That's great, honey. Now, don't forget Jessica's pageant rehearsal is this weekend." This favoritism wasn't just about milestones. It was woven into daily life. When we were teenagers, Jessica would constantly take my things without asking. Clothes, jewelry, even my favorite books. If I complained, I'd hear, "Jessica just admires you. You should feel flattered." And when she inevitably ruined or lost my things, I was told to stop being selfish. But the worst part was how my parents always defended her no matter what. Once, Jessica crashed my car while sneaking out to meet her boyfriend. I'd scrimped and saved for years to buy that car, but my parents brushed it off, saying, "We'll cover the repairs." Jessica's learned her lesson. I was furious, but they made me feel like I was overreacting. The breaking point came during Jessica's engagement. She got engaged to her longtime boyfriend, a guy from an influential family, and my parents acted like it was the social event of the year. They spent months obsessing over every detail of her wedding. Venues, dresses, flowers, you name it. I didn't mind their excitement until I learned how they were paying for it. My grandfather, who'd passed away a few years earlier, had left me a trust fund specifically for my future wedding or education. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to give me some security. Without telling me, my parents drained that account to fund Jessica's dream wedding. When I found out, I was devastated. I confronted them, asking how they could do something so unfair. My mom waved it off, saying, "Jessica needed it more than you. You're not even seeing anyone right now, so it's not like you'll be using it anytime soon." Jessica didn't even have the decency to apologize. She smirked and said, "You'll thank me when you get to come to the most amazing wedding ever. Besides, you've always been the smart one. You'll figure it out when it's your turn." That was it. Years of being overlooked, used, and dismissed boiled over in that moment. I told them I was done trying to fit into a family where I was nothing more than a convenient afterthought. For the first time in my life, I put myself first. I walked away. Walking away from my family wasn't easy. For years, I had convinced myself that if I worked harder, achieved more, or made myself indispensable, they would finally see my worth. But after the wedding fund betrayal, I realized that no amount of success would change their priorities. Leaving meant grieving the idea of a family I'd never truly had. At first, the silence was deafening. I hadn't just distanced myself. I blocked their numbers, deleted them from social media, and stopped attending any family gatherings. It felt drastic, but it was the only way I could create space to heal. Therapy became a lifeline. My therapist helped me unpack years of feeling invisible, teaching me that I didn't need anyone's permission to value myself. One of the first things I did was reassess my goals. I had spent so much of my life achieving for others that I had never stopped to ask what I wanted. It turned out I wanted plenty. I poured my energy into my job at a top law firm, taking on challenging cases and earning the respect of my colleagues. When a senior partner invited me to co-lead a high-profile case, I threw myself into it, working late nights and early mornings. My effort paid off. Not only did we win, but it also earned me a promotion to junior partner, years ahead of schedule. With my newfound confidence, I began to take risks outside of work. I started investing, something I'd always been curious about but too afraid to try. It wasn't easy at first. I made mistakes, lost some money, but I kept at it. Soon, I was building a modest portfolio, enough to give me financial security that no one could take away. The success didn't stop there. A few months after my promotion, I found my dream apartment in the heart of the city. It was a cozy but modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a small balcony overlooking a park. Signing that lease was symbolic. It wasn't just a place to live. It was proof that I could create a life entirely on my terms. For the first time in my adult life, I began to explore who I was outside of my family's shadow. I reconnected with old friends I had drifted away from, joined a book club, and even started painting, a hobby I hadn't touched since college. Somewhere along the way, I met Mark, a fellow lawyer who shared my passion for board games and late-night debates about philosophy. He was patient, kind, and most importantly, he saw me, not as an accessory or a consolation prize, but as someone worth celebrating. But my family wasn't entirely out of the picture. Jessica, ever the opportunist, occasionally sent texts or emails dripping with faux concern. She'd write things like, "I know you're upset, but family is family. We should stick together." It was never an apology, just a thinly veiled attempt to reel me back in. Each time I resisted the urge to reply. I reminded myself of the years I spent bending over backward for people who couldn't even give me basic respect. Still, moving on wasn't just about cutting them off. It was about letting go of the bitterness they left behind. Therapy taught me that forgiveness wasn't for them. It was for me. I didn't forgive their actions, but I forgave myself for tolerating them for so long. I learned to stop carrying their baggage, and that was the most liberating thing of all. By the time 2 years had passed, I barely recognized the woman I used to be. I wasn't the girl desperate for approval anymore. I was thriving in my career, deeply in love, and most importantly at peace. My world had expanded in ways I never thought possible, and I felt free. I wish I could say that was the end of the story, that I had walked away and lived happily ever after. But life has a way of bringing old wounds back to the surface, and my family wasn't done testing me yet. Just as I thought I had left my family's chaos behind, life had other plans. It had been 2 peaceful years since I walked away from them, and I'd truly built a life I loved. I was thriving professionally, sharing a wonderful relationship with Mark, and finding joy in small, everyday victories. But one phone call changed everything. I didn't recognize the number, so I let it go to voicemail. Later, I hesitated before playing the message. It was my mother's voice, trembling and filled with urgency. She explained that she and my father had been in a serious car accident. My father had broken his leg and several ribs, and my mother's injuries were even worse. Her voice cracked as she mentioned mounting medical bills and how they really needed me right now. For a moment I froze. Guilt, anger, and anxiety churned in my chest like a storm. Despite everything they had done, a part of me still felt responsible. After all, they were my parents, and their plea for help stirred memories of childhood moments when, however rare, they'd been kind. But those thoughts were quickly overshadowed by years of neglect and betrayal. Before I could process the voicemail, Jessica texted me. Her message was as blunt as ever. "Mom and Dad are struggling, and you need to step up. They're your responsibility too." Responsibility? The audacity of that word made my blood boil. Where was this newfound sense of duty when Jessica was spending thousands of dollars on designer handbags and luxury vacations? She lived in a mansion with her wealthy husband, yet somehow I was the one expected to bail them out? I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I called my therapist, venting all the emotions I couldn't even begin to sort through. She reminded me that it was okay to feel conflicted, but that I needed to set boundaries to protect my mental health. Eventually, I called Jessica back. I was determined to be calm and rational, but the moment she answered, her condescending tone set me on edge. Finally, she said, "I was wondering when you'd stop ignoring your family." I took a deep breath. "Jessica, I've never ignored the family. I've distanced myself because of the way I was treated. That hasn't changed." Her response was as dismissive as ever. "This isn't about you. Mom and Dad need us. You're a lawyer. You can afford to help." I couldn't hold back anymore. "Jessica, let's get one thing straight. I've spent my entire life being overlooked, used, and dismissed by this family. And now that things are hard, you expect me to swoop in and fix it? You're the golden child, remember? Mom and Dad have always prioritized you. Maybe it's your turn to step up. She scoffed. You're being dramatic. I can't help as much as you can. We're barely getting by. Spare me, I interrupted. You're married to a man who bought you a second Mercedes for your anniversary. If you wanted to help, you could. You're choosing not to because you think I'll do it instead. Jessica didn't like being called out. Fine, she snapped. If you want to be selfish, go ahead. Just don't come crying to us when you regret it. The call left me shaking, not because I doubted my decision, but because of how easily Jessica had twisted the narrative. She had always known how to weaponize guilt, and for a fleeting moment I almost let her. But then I reminded myself of everything I had endured. Every slight, every dismissal, every betrayal. Helping them now would only validate years of mistreatment, and I refused to be a pawn in their game any longer. Over the next few days, my parents tried every tactic in the book. They left voicemails laced with guilt, recounting sacrifices they'd supposedly made for me. My mother even said, "We raised you, fed you, gave you everything. The least you can do is help us now." It stung, but I knew better. Their so-called sacrifices were simply the bare minimum of parenting, and even that was often overshadowed by their blatant favoritism toward Jessica. They weren't reaching out because they valued me, they were reaching out because they needed something. When the guilt trips didn't work, they escalated to anger. My father left a voicemail accusing me of being ungrateful and selfish. My mother cried, saying I was tearing the family apart. Each message was like a dagger aimed at my resolve, but I played them for Mark, who reminded me of the truth. Their manipulation was just another chapter in a long history of mistreatment. Finally, I sent a single, concise email. I told them I was sorry for their situation but that I couldn't help financially. I reminded them of the choices they had made and how those choices had consequences. Then I blocked their numbers and email addresses once again. But Jessica wasn't finished. A week later, she showed up at my apartment, uninvited and unannounced. The sight of her on my doorstep was jarring. She was as polished as ever, wearing designer clothes and her signature smug expression. "Can we talk?" she asked, though her tone made it clear she wasn't really asking. I let her in but stayed standing, arms crossed. "What do you want, Jessica?" She launched into a lecture about how I was abandoning the family, how I'd regret my decision, and how I needed to do the right thing. Her words were a carefully rehearsed mix of guilt and condescension, but I wasn't falling for it. "Jessica," I said firmly, "you don't get to waltz in here and demand anything from me. I've spent my entire life cleaning up after you, sacrificing for you, and being ignored because of you. I won't do it anymore. If Mom and Dad need help, you're more than capable. I'm done." Her face flushed with anger. "You think you're better than us now?" "No," I replied calmly. "I think I finally value myself enough to stop being your doormat." With that, I opened the door and gestured for her to leave. She stormed out, muttering under her breath, but I didn't care. For the first time, I felt like I had truly stood up for myself, and it was exhilarating. But as I closed the door, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Not for Jessica or my parents, but for the family I had always wished for, the one that never really existed. After Jessica stormed out of my apartment, I stood in the quiet of my living room, my thoughts swirling. The confrontation had been necessary, even cathartic, but it left an ache I couldn't shake. For years I had hoped, however naively, that one day my family would change, that Jessica would acknowledge her selfishness, that my parents would see me for who I truly was. That hope had finally crumbled under the weight of their actions. I knew I had done the right thing, yet the sadness lingered. I wasn't mourning them, I was mourning the idea of what could have been. Jessica and I could have been close, supporting each other through life's ups and downs. My parents could have been a source of encouragement and pride, instead of manipulation and favoritism. I had to accept that those relationships would never exist, and that was harder than I expected. In the following weeks, Jessica's behavior became even more erratic. She started a smear campaign against me within the family, painting herself as the devoted daughter burdened with parents in need while I played the selfish, ungrateful sister. I started receiving cold texts from distant relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years, chastising me for abandoning family. I always knew you were a bit stuck up, but this is low even for you. Your parents sacrificed everything for you and this is how you repay them? Family comes first no matter what. You should be ashamed. At first these messages stung, but then I realized how hollow they were. None of these people had ever been involved in my life. None of them knew the years of pain I had endured, the countless times I had been dismissed or ignored. They were speaking from Jessica's script, parroting her version of events without question. I blocked them all. Mark was my rock through all of this. He listened when I needed to vent, reassured me when guilt crept in, and reminded me of how far I'd come. "You've already done the hardest part," he said one evening as we sat on the couch. "You walked away and built an amazing life. Don't let them pull you back into their toxicity. You deserve better." But Jessica wasn't done yet. A few days later I came home to find a handwritten letter slipped under my door. It was from her. "You've made your point," it began. "But this is bigger than your feelings. Mom and Dad are suffering and they need us. You can play the victim all you want, but at the end of the day you'll have to live with the consequences of your choices. Family is family, and turning your back on them is something you'll regret forever." The letter went on, dripping with passive-aggressive jabs and moral grandstanding. I read it twice, my anger building with every line. Jessica had never once taken responsibility for her actions. She didn't apologize for taking my wedding fund, for stealing my belongings, or for leaving me to clean up her messes. And now she had the audacity to guilt me into saving the very people who had made me feel invisible my entire life. I tore the letter in half and threw it away. For the first time I didn't feel conflicted, I felt resolute. The final blow came 2 weeks later when Jessica showed up at my office unannounced. I was in the middle of preparing for a client meeting when the receptionist called to tell me I had a personal visitor. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I stepped out to the lobby and found Jessica waiting, her arms crossed and her expression smug. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my tone cool and professional. "I wouldn't have come if you hadn't ignored me," she replied. "We need to talk." I glanced at the clock. "I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Make it quick." Jessica launched into yet another guilt-laden speech about family loyalty, responsibility, and sacrifice. She even had the nerve to say, "You're successful now because Mom and Dad gave you a good foundation. You owe them." I took a deep breath, then looked her directly in the eye. "Jessica, let me make this as clear as possible. I don't owe anyone anything, least of all people who spent their entire lives ignoring and dismissing me. I've built my success despite them, not because of them. And you're just upset because for the first time in your life, someone's telling you no." Her jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake," she said. "One day you'll realize that." I stepped closer, lowering my voice but keeping it firm. "The only mistake I made was staying in this family as long as I did. Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Unlike you, I don't have the luxury of living off someone else's money." Jessica's face turned red with anger, but she didn't say another word. She stormed out, leaving me standing in the lobby. That evening I made a decision. I accepted a promotion that required relocating to another state. A fresh start, far from the shadows of my family. Moving meant leaving behind the city I had grown to love, but it also meant true freedom. As I packed up my apartment, I reflected on everything that had happened. My parents and Jessica had tried every tactic to pull me back into their web: guilt, manipulation, anger. But I had stood my ground. And while it hurt to close the door on them for good, it also felt like lifting a weight off my shoulders. Blocking them permanently wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of self-preservation. For the first time I could see a future that was entirely my own, free from their drama and toxicity. When the moving truck pulled away, I stood in the empty apartment and felt a sense of peace I had never known before. Call to action. What would you have done in my shoes? Was I wrong to cut ties, or was it the right decision? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories like this one. See you next time.